Hello, this is Don Phillips again of the Abundant Harvest Church in Kansas City, Kansas. And I don't know if you've ever tuned into any of our messages before. If not, I want to welcome you. If you have, I'm glad to see you back again. I'm going to talk to you today about a very serious subject. I've entitled it, If the Foundations Are Destroyed. Now let me read a passage to you from the 11th chapter of Psalm. In fact, I'm going to read that entire chapter of 7 verses, and you'll understand why I entitled it this way. In the Lord I put my trust. How can you say to my soul, flee as a bird to your mountain? For look, the wicked bend their bow. They make ready their arrow on the string, that they may shoot secretly at the upright in heart. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes behold, his eyelids test the sons of men. The Lord tests the righteous, but the wicked will be the one who loves violence. His soul hates. Upon the wicked he will rain coals, fire, and brimstone, and a burning wind shall be the portion of their cup. For the Lord is righteous, and he loves righteousness. His countenance beholds the upright. I'm going to read that same passage to you, those same 7 verses, only this time I'm going to read it to you from the Message Bible. It puts a little bit of a different slant on it. Maybe you'll understand it better. Here's the way the Message Bible presents this chapter. I have already run for dear life straight to the arms of God. So why should I run away now when you say, run to the mountains? The evil bows are bent. The wicked arrows aimed to shoot under cover of darkness, every heart open to God. The bottoms dropped out of the country. Good people don't have a chance. But God hasn't moved to the mountains. His holy address hasn't changed. He's in charge, as always. His eyes taking everything in, his eyelash unblinking, examining Adam's flesh and blood inside and out, not missing a thing. He tests the good and the bad alike. If anyone cheats, God's outraged. Fail the test, and you're out. Out in a hail of firestones, drinking from a canteen filled with hot desert wind. God's holiness is putting things right. He loves getting the line straight, setting us straight. Once we're standing tall, we can look him straight in the eye. Now, I think we could all agree that our world has undergone a cultural revolution in the past 50 or 60 years. And anytime there's a revolution, whether it's cultural, political, a business revolution, a technological revolution, things change. Certain changes take place, and it changes how we live our lives, how we do our business, and etc., how we're governed also. Sometimes the changes in our lives are more drastic than at other times. In fact, the results of a revolution can bring about changes that we don't count on. And in fact, changes that we didn't see coming, and they often come so imperceptibly that we don't really see them until they have us completely surrounded. Suddenly we're thrust into a worldview with which we're unfamiliar, and we wonder what happened and how it happened and why we didn't see it coming. Daniel Yankovich, a social watchdog, says that a genuine cultural revolution is one with which there is a decisive break with the shared meanings of the past. And if culture is to provide a coherent set of answers when a cultural revelation occurs, just as you and I are breaking away radically from some common worldviews of the past, it results in confusion. For instance, where is the religion of the USA today? What is that religion today? We know what it was about 75 years ago. But today, I think we can all agree that something's happened in the U.S. back in the 1960s, and looking back, we can all agree that a cultural revolution began back then. As a result, we find ourselves the possessors of a culture that has come unhinged from the Creator's underpinnings. That's what I want to be talking about today. The very foundations of our culture are disappearing as we see ourselves drifting farther and farther from the 245-year-old institution that was created. The Cultural Revolution is real. The antagonism against religion is real. The rancor against many of our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms is real. And not only is it real, but it is intense. It's going for our jugular by affecting every institution in the land. I don't know about you, but I often hear random thoughts that really make no sense, and they're used to explain or excuse a worldview that basically makes no sense. As an example, I heard someone on a media outlet recently say that if a person steals something from you or me, and it's something they need, not just what they want, it really isn't stealing, they have a right to it. I had to listen 2 or 3 times to make sure that's what they were saying. But it really isn't stealing, he had a right to it. Now, following that line of thinking, if someone stole your car or your truck because they had a need for it, it wouldn't really be stealing if they really needed it. The fact that you bought it, you paid for it, you have it insured, and it's in your name doesn't even enter into the argument. And the fact that you would now have no way to get back and forth to work does not stir in the argument either. Does that make sense to you? Doesn't to me. None whatsoever. I could give you more examples, but I'll spare you. I want to go on. Because I am convinced that today there are foundations of our society that are being systematically destroyed, and I plan to consider 4 or 5 of them in this message that we're just allowing these to crumble. First of all, I want to talk about the foundation of biblical spirituality. The sense of the eternal within us is unshakable. We can read in Ecclesiastes 3:11 that Solomon wrote, God has put eternity into the heart of man. Well, just for a minute, I want you to go back with me to 1968. It was Christmas Day. That's when the 3 Apollo astronauts aboard Apollo 8 were propelled by their rockets on a course that would take them around behind the moon on the dark side. But just moments later, when they watched the Earth rise over the horizon of the moon, they were awestruck. And the only words to fall from their lips were, "In the beginning, God." Their minds at that moment were not on the brilliant scientists who had designed the Apollo spaceship, or those who had planned and laid out the specifics for that colossal trip. No, their thoughts were only on the God who had created it all. See, God has truly put eternity in the heart of man. The Apostle Paul is one of the only very few men who have experienced that feeling of eternity for real when, as he says in 2 Corinthians 12:2, he was caught up into the third heaven where he heard inexpressible words which is not lawful for man to hear. He starts his 12th chapter talking about his experience, but then realizes that human words cannot describe it. So he says he cannot really say whether he was in the body or out of the body. He just really doesn't know how to talk about it because it's impossible to communicate with any clarity. Yes, God put eternity in the heart of man. And as he experienced it absolutely for a brief period of time, he also wrote, "To live is Christ, to die is gain. For I am hard pressed between the two, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better." In other words, he had tasted it. He knew it was better. He would be excited if he thought he could make that trip again today, but he couldn't. I think I can understand Paul's desire here, don't you? A desire to be with the Lord rather than in this swamp that we seem to be in now. Not just in this country, but in the whole world. You and I have only read about the glories of heaven. We believe what we read, but we have not experienced it as yet. And yet we sing the song. I remember when I was a child, many years ago, we sang the song. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright, shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. A dear brother in Christ was passing from this life, and the family that were present all knew it, and they asked him to describe his thoughts. What can you tell us about this right now? And he said, here's what he said. Just think of stepping on a strange shore and finding out it's heaven. Or think of touching a hand that you're not familiar with and finding it's God's hand. Or breathing in some new air and realizing, hey, this is celestial air. Or waking up in glory and finding out it's home. Wow. What a thought. You know why? Because God had put eternity in that man's heart, and he made certain in his lifetime that he was able to get his sins forgiven and be sure he was on his way to heaven. Oh yeah, we've been given eternity in our hearts, and we read about it in the Word, but we haven't experienced it yet. However, now for the past 50 or so years, our religious culture, who by and large our rebellious culture, who rejects about anything spiritual, has been trying to steal it from our hearts, trying to get us to believe that now is all there is, that the Bible is not the Word of God, that attending church is unnecessary, money and self, it's what it's all about. Well, I'm going to tell you, you can follow that if you want to. I'm trying my best to stay away from that point of view. And along with this, we've lost our happiness, our peace, our reasoning, because we have lost our moral and spiritual center. Having lost our inner eternity, what God planted inside of us, we now find ourselves in stark emptiness of the temporal. As a result, we're living in what sociologists, doctors, and spiritual leaders identify as the age of anxiety. Yes, tolerating the cultural rebellion has allowed us to do what we please, when we please, with whom we please, and against whom we please. But the cost has been beyond belief. And only with God's help can we get this foundation repaired. There's another foundation, we call it morality. Every civilization likes to believe that they are a moral civilization. The Jews believed that, and they attributed that morality to God. The Greeks claimed it and attributed it to the ideal. Arnold Toynbee, a British historian from the early 1900s, wrote, and I'm going to quote this to you, "Our Western civilization is now the first in 21 civilizations that he has studied that is attempting to go on assuming there is no moral law." And something serious has happened. That's the words of Toynbee. Probably most of you hearing this message have had those moments when all of a sudden you realize that something's changing. Things are not like they used to be. We realize that maybe we just can't reach out and put our finger on it, but we can feel it and we can sense it, and still we know that our country has changed. Perhaps you can't quite lay your finger on it, but you can sense it, because things are not like what they used to be. And I will be the first to say that sometimes we need change. Oh yeah, there's times we need change. Remember the old LP records and the Victrolas? Oh, I'm happy for the change that has taken place in that media. How about the old cars? Some people like to rebuild those old cars and really fix them up, and that's fine. But you know, these old cars were without air conditioning. They were without backup cameras. They were without navigation. They were without heated seats. Oh yeah, I'm glad we've got that change. And what about the days when we had courts that would uphold our Constitution? I don't like the change I'm seeing in our courts here in this country. And from what I read, it's happening in other countries as well. And remember the time when the church was honored and the Bible was considered a holy book? I don't like the changes I see here. And I want to tell you that these changes have taken place in some of our churches. There was a time when homosexuality was considered a sin, and we prayed for those involved in this lifestyle. But today, we are expected to honor and celebrate the perversion. I don't like these changes. A few years ago, out-of-wedlock babies and their mothers were loved and accepted, but today we're expected to celebrate them. I remember a day when we expected our politicians to be honest and upright. But today we're supposed to celebrate their lies and their hypocrisy and by all means re-elect them at the next election. Our TV shows, movies, and talk shows are overrun with profanity, nudity, sexual freedom, and celebration of homosexuality. And many of us, including in our churches, have accepted that as the new norm. Another sure sign that our moral foundation is being destroyed. There's a message we need to glean from these changes, and listen to me carefully. It's a proven fact that what we applaud, we encourage. Listen to me. Be careful what you're applauding, because you're encouraging it. Here's another fact we must not overlook. We must be extremely careful about what we celebrate. When we lost our way spiritually, our very existence was redefined. Losing our moral sense has redefined our very being. Let me talk about another foundation. This is the foundation of accountability. You see, psychology has taught us that there's nobody to blame for anything. You can always take whatever you've done and you can push it off on someone else or something else. Let me read you something that Robert Fitch, a philosopher of jurisprudence, has written. He said, "Ours is an age where ethics has become obsolete. It is superseded by science. It is deleted by psychology and dismissed as controversial by philosophy. It is drowned in compassion. It evaporates into aesthetics and retreats before relativism. The usual moral distinctions between good and bad are simply drowned in a maudlin emotion in which we feel more sympathy for the murderer than for the person murdered. We feel more sympathy for the adulterer than for the one who was betrayed. We've gotten to the place today where we have actually begun to believe the real guilty party is the one who somehow caused it all, and the victim is the perpetrator of the crime. I want to tell you, folks, that is one sad testimony, and what I'm seeing in our country and around the world today, not only are the foundations of our country falling apart, they're falling apart in many other countries. How sad. Yes, we've watched our foundation of accountability begin to crumble. I ask you to look at our court system, the decisions they made in just the past few months. And you might come to believe that nobody is to blame for anything anymore. We spend millions of dollars of government money every year to educate our children, yet our schools never rate number one when compared to schools in other countries, yet there seems to be no accountability required. We just go ahead and do the same thing over and over again. But let me tell you, in the Garden of Eden, thousands of years ago, when our first parents were being called to give account for their breaking of God's orders, Adam blamed Eve. He said, "The woman you gave me." And when God turned to Eve, she blamed the serpent. But God knew better, and they were given their walking papers. Let me assure you that you may blame your birthplace, your upbringing, the era in which you've lived, your spouse, your parents, even blame your children, your pastor, your teachers, or whomever you decide to blame. But God knows the truth. And He says that eventually you will give account for your own deeds. Today, one of the things we hear most is that someone else is responsible for our own situations. It's easy to blame someone else, but our country was founded on the basis, if you play, you pay. And I think we need to get back to it. And our court systems were established to keep all of us accountable, every one of us. And yet, in many cases, they're failing to do the job. By reaching this milestone of non-accountability in our country, we are eradicating conscience. It's dangerous. Now I want to talk about another foundation. This is the foundation of benevolence. Flames of anger are rising everywhere in our country. You can't watch the news without seeing people that are so angry. And everybody gets offended. They get offended if you're white. They get offended if you're black. They get offended if you're some other color. They get offended if you're tall. They get offended if you're short. They have to have something to be offended at. That way they can blame their actions on the fact that somebody offended them. Well, if you dare listen to a talk show these days, you'll hear the anger and profanity. The news outlets are hardly worth watching today because of the rancor that is rampant in our media outlets. And while they're doing all of this, the news is noticeably absent. Americans are losing their feelings of benevolence for their fellow countrymen. Even our conversation is losing its fairness and benevolence. While the Constitution on which our country was founded guarantees freedom of speech, we have whole movements today bent on destroying that freedom. Not only that, but our conversation has become so coarse. Again, a move from a time of gentleness when that was one of our strengths. Conversation with some people today with whom you may disagree may result in you being called by some name that is popular in our coarse society, even though it may in no way describe you. Our TV shows, our movies, our talk shows are overrun with profanity and nudity and sexual freedom and homosexuality, and we've accepted it all as the norm. I'm repeating that, I know, but I want you to think about it. Another sign of our level of benevolence slipping is something called cancel culture, which is described, and I looked this up because I wanted to make sure I understood it. It's described as a phenomenon combining celebrity gossip, vigilantism, and mass hysteria. And they are wanting to destroy everything we have. With that, give me a break. I'm certain that we're watching the foundations of benevolence crumble right before our eyes. But I want you to notice there was a question in that. There are several questions, but the main question that I'm dealing with today in the passage of Scripture that I read to you, if the foundations are destroyed, and I'm telling you they are being destroyed, what can the righteous do? In the previous few minutes, I've shown you the facts regarding foundations on which our culture is built. They're crumbling. We're destroying them. Now the question is, can we turn around and rebuild these foundations, or is it too late? If we can do it, how do we go about it? You heard the verses that I read from Psalms 11. And this again comes from the Message Bible. I've already run straight to the arms of God. So why should I run away now when you say, run to the mountains, the evil bows are bent, the wicked arrows aimed to shoot under cover of darkness at every heart open to God. The bottom's dropped out of our country. Good people don't have a chance. I want to tell you that's the way a lot of people feel today. And we know the devilish hosts have their arrows bent. We're well aware that the wicked leave their arrows up tight against their bowstrings. We know that they are creating a darkness from which they can shoot their arrows at us in discretion. The bottom does seem to be falling out of the country. So again, what can the righteous do? Should we just run and get out of their reach? Do we say, well, there's darkness here, just as we were promised, so they can hide in the darkness and shoot their poison arrows at us from close range, and we don't even see it coming? So back to the question, what should the righteous do? In fact, what can we do? Well, first, we have to identify our enemy. And the Bible does that very well for us in Exodus 6:11, where it says, in Ephesians 6:11, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. I understand that when you hear the threats or watch the news and see them make the threats, it looks like a person, maybe even a person that you recognize. That is when you have to remember the verse above, which I just read to you, that describes the enemy in no uncertain terms. You're not really threatened by that individual. It is a threat from hell itself. Satan is directing it. So how far and how fast do you need to run in order to get away from his arrows? You can't run fast enough and you can't run far enough. Let me assure you of that. You can't remove yourself from the danger of his arrows unless you run to Jesus for safety. That's your only hope. Psalm 91 verse 1 says, he who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, he is my refuge, my fortress, my God. In him will I trust. And surely he shall deliver me from the snare of the fowler and from the perilous pestilence. He will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you shall take refuge. His truth shall be your shield and buckler. I like verse 5. You shall not be afraid of the terror by night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that walks in darkness, nor of the destruction that lays wait at noonday. No, God has not moved his operations. I read that verse to you before. Let me read it again. I'm reading verses 4 to 7 of Psalms 11. But God hasn't moved to the mountain. His holy address hasn't changed. He's in charge as always. His eyes taking everything in his eyelids unblinking, examining atoms, flesh and blood, inside and out, not missing a thing. He tests the good and the bad alike. If anyone cheats, God is outraged. The test, if you fail that test, you're out. And in a hail of firestones, you'll be drinking from a canteen filled with desert wind. God's business is putting things right. He loves getting the line straight, setting it straight. Once we're standing tall, we'll be able to see him face to face. Did you notice that this incredible scripture steers us directly to God? Not to some political party, not to some politician, not to some news outlet, not even some pastor. The writer of this psalm is telling us, go directly to the one who's in charge. A lot of people like to think they're in charge, and they talk like they're in charge, and they act like they're in charge. Any power they have, they got from God, and he can withdraw it at any time, but he's never lost his power. And we have been given an open invitation to come to his headquarters. Listen to this. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Be thankful to him and bless his name. And then in Hebrews 4:6 we read, "Let us therefore come boldly into the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need." Do you find yourself in a time of need today? If you do, let me assure you that verse 5 of that passage that I just read to you says He is in charge always. Notice that verse says that we may obtain mercy. If you need anything, He's in charge. So we may boldly say, "The Lord is my helper. I will not fear what man can do to me." Did you know that the Bible tells us do not fear 365 times? That's one for every day. So if your circumstances have you living in fear, run. Don't walk, but run to the throne of grace. He's saying to you to come on in boldly. And then Paul tells us, be anxious for nothing, but in everything, amid the crumbling foundations, among things you don't like and you don't understand, in everything, he says, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your request be made known to God. I hope you've gotten something out of this today. I hope it encourages your heart. I pray that it's blessed you. And if it has, I pray you'll share this with everyone you know. Because I believe most of America can see today that our foundations are in a mess. We need to have them repaired, and there's only one way. That's with the help of God. So if you're in the Kansas City area and you want to be in a service tomorrow, I will have to tell you that we canceled our service tomorrow because of the extreme temperature and because both my wife and I are suffering a little bit with colds and flu and bronchitis. So we just had to cancel the service tomorrow. But there will be a service next Sunday at 10:30. It's at the Abundant Harvest Church at 4830 Shawnee Drive in Kansas City, Kansas. God bless you.